All right, so quick backstory. There was a big storm in Atlanta. I woke up at like 3 or 4 in the morning from a notification on my phone that told me the power in my studio was completely out. I did a little digging and found out the power on the entire block was out. I had a production that was scheduled to be at like 8 o'clock call time in the morning. Thankfully, I had a friend and fellow photographer who had a studio that let me borrow it for this production. And that's how it landed me in this specific studio where I'll begin to break down this picture. All right, so let's just break down the lighting. Just off the bat, what do we see? Take a minute and look at it. All right, so I see the cheekbones got some light, and there's some light up in here, and there's a little bit of light more in here, light here. And I also see that there's fall off under the chin. I see that there's some lights that are catching the edge of the ear. I see that there's a little bit of a highlight all the way at the top of the hair, all the way up here. I want to kind of pay attention to, there's a sheen going on right here to the light, and that same sheen here and here, maybe kind of in here as well. But then I'll switch colors real quick, and then we see that it's a little darker here, and it's darker here, and it's darker here, darker in there. We can tell based off of this that there seems like there's a light that is pointed this way, right? I can argue that technically that light seems like it's like up here somewhere pointed. Well, let me do a better job of that. It's like pointed like this, right? Because it's catching that highlight in her eye. Let's zoom in on that. Let me erase some of this. All right, so it zooms in. When I zoom in, you can see that catch light in her eye, and it's at the top of her eye. So if I were to allow that to be a line, I would imagine that that light source would have to be coming from above her head and kind of pointing down, which also makes sense as to why I'm getting that hotter spot on the front of her fingers compared to the center. I'm calling the center the side that basically is lined up with the camera. So this side is lined up with the camera, this side is lined up with the camera lens, but then I'm saying that this side of her finger and that side of her finger, arguably are like the left and the right, and then the part that I drew out in the front is what I'm considering to be the front. So I'm saying that it looks like there's a light that's coming from whatever the left or the right outside of the frame that creates that highlight on her fingers. It creates the highlight on the front side of her face, right? Like all up in here seems like that's where the highlight is, right? And then that highlight also catches the edges of the ear. It even catches this kind of part up here. But because we have that dead spot right here, it also tells me that the source of the light is relatively small because it's not filling in all the shadows as much as it's giving me a highlight to shadow side. All right, so this is our next picture, same lighting setup, and we're looking for those same kind of things, right? So I see there's a highlight on here, highlight over here. Yes, highlights all up in here, highlights there, right? It's still catching that same area of the ear, right? We're still catching some of those nice hot spots or highlights on the hair, right? And then like that other image, I'm seeing that there's these kisses of highlights that are coming across the top, right? And they're coming from a different direction. So that's one of the things that I didn't point out on that previous image. While I acknowledge, let me get rid of that for a second. I acknowledge that there's a light source coming from this direction, right? Gotta be. It's not coming from the front. So it's not coming from me shooting from this direction, right? Because the light would actually give us highlights or at least illuminate in those areas, but that's technically where the shadows are typically falling. So I acknowledge that there's a light that's coming from camera left, but what about camera right? So we also can acknowledge that based off of this lighting that we're getting, there's a source that's coming from somewhere around here. Actually, let me change that to this. Somewhere around here that's pointed in this direction, right? And the reason why I say that is because I'm catching those very, very kind of subtle highlights across the top of her hair. Let me erase this so we can zoom in. Those really subtle highlights across the top of her hair that indicate that there's a light source that's doing that. This specific place that I'm shooting at is a little tricky because the ceiling is lower. So you could be getting some of that kickback from the ceiling being so low in this kind of office space styled environment. But because that light is so sharp and so punchy, it wouldn't be a light that's bouncing off of a drop down ceiling or something. It looks like it's actually a light source. And I'm actually seeing it all the way at the top of her head up here. I'm seeing it all the way over here, up here, and then I actually don't even see it down here as much. So that lets me know that this is much more of a light that's coming from the top, perhaps even coming from behind her, because that light's not even making it over to the front side of the camera side of everything. I'm not seeing it over here. I'm seeing it technically on the rim. So you know what that light is called? Did we see it on the rim? Leave it in the comments if you know. All right, so here's our picture. Let's just do a quick lay of the land so we know what to look at and what to not look at. Obviously, you see the person holding the light. That's Keith, one of the dopest first assistants in the area, but don't worry about him right now. And then there's this big octobox. That's not important. There are 4 lights involved, but based off of this image, you can only see 3, so I'll explain how they operate. So, right, I'm gonna call this 1, I'm gonna call this one 2, and I'm gonna call this one 3. So we got 1, let's actually make this marker a little bit bigger, just in case it's hard to see on screen. We got 1 here, we got 2 here, we have 3 here, and then behind me as I'm taking the picture, there's what I would call like an overall fill or a wash, and that behind me is illuminating all of her. That's going to be our number 4. That's our 4th light. What I want to do is try to talk about these in a way I haven't talked about on this channel, and I don't think I have. And what I mean by that is, normally when I'm doing these demos or when I'm showing these lighting setups, I'm not showing a bunch of different lights. So sometimes people have an issue with understanding how to use different lights, or when you're starting to use all the different lights, how they show up or what the characteristics are. So we have this light, right? And this light is playing a specific role. You'll see, I mean, this is a terrible mock-up, but this is an example of how that light should be showing up if it was just that light in itself. We referenced how you're gonna get this illumination on her hands and on her face, and you can see it in this modeling light, so you get an idea, but this mock-up of this picture is like a crude example. Then we have this light up here that has a grid on it. This is that hair light, or it's gonna be that rim light, right? So you can see an example with this kind of picture. Again, it's somewhat crude, but I mean, you get an idea of what this light is doing in particular. And then we have this light, and this light is essentially acting as somewhat of a fill on this backside, right? Now, what most people don't consider is how they use those lights, not necessarily just how they use those lights, but how the characteristics of those lights play together. So this key, which is my primary light source, is punchy. It's a reflector. It's sharp. It's very contrasty. It actually is going to be coming in at something like an f8. Let's say f9, f8 or f9. Right? This softbox may very well also be exposed at an f9, but because of the size of the softbox and the way that it throws the light renders differently when it hits the subject. So I might end up actually dialing this back down a bit so that it doesn't flatten out what I'm trying to create with this primary grid light up here with this light. So this is going to be metered at f9. And then if I go over here, instead of this being metered at f9, I might have this metered at like f5.6, right? I might have this metered at 5.6. I might have it at like 6.1, right? Something in that regard, but I think 5.6 feels good because I want the light to basically fill in the shadows slightly, but I don't want it to play up and be as bright as my key light. Right now, if I go to this, which is the rim light again is in an area where it essentially is playing into the shadows. When you have a light that's basically competing with darkness, you don't have to worry about having to make it as bright as your key light, because it doesn't necessarily have to overpower the key light to be able to show up. So this rim light is basically lighting the back of her body, or the edges is what we're going to see on camera. So it could actually be exposed at something like an f9, and maybe all the way up to even an f16, depending on how punchy you want that light to show up on the rim. So for example, if I had this at f9 and it just was too flat and I couldn't see it, I might make it more powerful so it exposes it at an f16. All right, so we have our key light at being like an f9. We have the rim light that's playing from the back that's like at an f9 or an f16. And then we have our fill light being an f5.6. So take a second really quickly and take a wild guess on what that light is that's coming from behind me that's illuminating the front of our subject. So we know that the key light is at f9. We know that this rim light or hair light is at f9, f16. And then we know that this side fill is at 5.6. What do we believe that overall wash on the entire set might be? Would it be closer? Would it be closer to something like an f9, f16, or is it going to be closer to something like an f5.6? Now here's the challenge. You can't obviously see the light, so you may be wondering what that light is. It's one of those PLM umbrellas that Alien B sells. The idea is that it just gives me an overall wash on the levels of the entire set. So it's just illuminating light over this entire set, not just on her, but on everything. And proximity wise, it's farther away than these lights. I mean, this is f9 at whatever, roughly 6 feet perhaps. Same thing with that hair light up here is probably at like maybe 4 or 5 feet. Keep in mind the ceilings are maybe 9 feet high, so I can't go too high up and too far back because I don't have the option in this situation. This softbox that's on the side over here is probably somewhere around 3 feet, but that umbrella that's behind me is easily 7 or 8 feet back. Now all of a sudden the distance of the light starts to play a significant role in the output. So even if I take that light and put it at the full power, and depending on what type of lights you have, it might have some type of number reference, that output of that light, I'm gonna say is gonna end up having to be something like maybe a f9 still. And I would normally, depending on where that light was located, I would expect it to be closer to like a 5. Oh, that's the wrong color. I would expect it to be something like a 5.6. But because of how far back it has to be and the amount of distance it has to throw the light to kind of cast that shine or that light over the entire set, it's gonna have to give me a lot more power. And because of that, it might end up having to be at even f16, right? It might have to be at f16, or it might even have to be higher than that. So just consider that for a second. If you think about all of the different lights that I have on this set, which is, what did I say, 4 lights total, we have to consider the fact that all of them aren't at the same output because they all have different roles, and those outputs vary not just solely based off of their role, but what type of modifier they are, and also the distance in relation to the subject. So this light, this key light, the actual power output from the light may very well be at the lower range of what the light is able to do. So let's say that this light in particular could go from a 1 power to a 10 power. Because it's on a grid inside of this reflector, it might be on a 3, but that 3 still ends up being something like an f9 in the exposure. If I take this exact same type of light and put it inside of this, if I put it at 3, the exposure on this resulting subject, if I put it on 3 and I put it inside of this box, the resulting exposure on her might end up being like f2.8, right? Because it has to, it's a low power, and it has to break through this softbox, and it also has to kind of get broken up by the grid that's inside of here, right? And then it also has to make it the distance to the subject. So it has a lot more to fight through to make it to my subject. So even though my key light might be at 3, this rim or this hair light can't necessarily be at the same output as my primary or my key light because of the modifier and the distance. Now you have another scenario with this softbox. The softbox is arguably larger than both the reflector, and it's larger than this strip box. The strip box is probably the same length, but not the same width, right? So, but it also doesn't have a grid. But I don't want this light to be at 3 because I know that the size of the light, for one, is going to require a little bit more output. And remember, I'm using that 3 as a reference for that 1 to 10 scale on the output power of the light, not an aperture of an f3, literally just the power output of this Profoto light. So if I said that this was at a 3 power output, I may not be able to get more than maybe a f3.5 and f4 exposure. And because I'm already setting my camera to f9, because I'm setting my camera set aperture to f9, because that is what the key light, the primary light source that I'm focused on making sure the exposure is correct for, is set at. So I'm not setting my aperture at whatever this exposes at, because it's going to make this a lot brighter than I would want it to be. I'm setting my exposure to what my key light is supposed to be, and then everything else on the set has to basically play along with that, right? So this softbox might end up being somewhere closer to f5.6. So if it's closer to f5.6, I might find that the setting or the power output of 3 doesn't work. Maybe I have to go up to a 5 or a 6 on the power so that I can get the actual exposure by the time it illuminates from that softbox and it shows up on my model or my subject. It might be at an f5.6 or an f8. Again, I don't want it to be as bright as an f9 shows up. So that's why I end up dialing it a bit lower, so that it might end up being at like an f5.6 or an f8. Again, the other thing to consider is that the light that is being emitted from here, right, it doesn't show up on this backside. So the backside is going to just be dark. So because the backside is dark, it's like any amount of light that hits that backside is going to help bring it up from the shadows. The amount is going to be contingent upon what you actually set the output to on the softbox, right? Then I wanted to take that overall light that's behind me as the photographer and basically illuminate the entire set. Not just her, not just her body, not just her hair, but the entire set. So I use a really large modifier. I have it set behind me and as high as I can. All things considered, the ceiling is relatively low, so that's not saying that it's super high. And then the output ends up being something that doesn't overpower or change the characteristics of what that grid spot is doing, or what the strip box is doing, or what the softbox fill is doing. It's essentially enough so that it makes sure that none of my shadows fall into a complete darkness that is blocked up and underexposed. Let me know if that makes sense in the comments. I want to start talking at a more high level way about the technical aspects of the lighting. Let me know if I need to break what I'm saying down even more, and I'll gladly do it. That's it for this one. Peace.